degree from Columbia University. He was Director of Central Intelligence from 1973 to 1976. Earlier, he had been Chief of the CIA's Far Eastern Division from 63 to 68, and its Executive Director and Comptroller from 72 to 73. His intelligence career began during World War II when he parachuted into France and Norway to work with French and Norwegian resistance forces for the Office of Strategic Services. Since leaving the CIA, Mr. Colby's been a consultant on international and domestic political matters to various corporations, governments, and investment organizations. He's practiced international and American law in Washington, has written 2 books, Honorable Men and Lost Victory, and numerous articles, and has lectured and appeared in many different fora throughout the nation and abroad. He is counsel to Washington law firm of Donovan, Leisure, Rogovin, Hughes, and Scheller. Mr. Colby has received numerous awards and distinctions during his career, including the National Security Medal in 1976, and was a decorated World War II veteran. He's going to discuss today the issue with us of the future role of strategic intelligence, and it's with great pleasure that I turn the podium over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to chat with you about the future of U.S. intelligence and where we're going with it. I think when you learned that I was coming, some of you sort of said, well, hot dog, we see a real live spy. And already some of you are a little disappointed. He doesn't look much like a spy. Where's the cloak? Where's the dagger? Where's the blonde? Isn't this what we get when we get a James Bond or something here? Well, I guess I've been a spy, even though I don't look like one. I've gone out of airplanes over enemy country, and I've flown around the jungles of Southeast Asia for paramilitary operations, and I've walked up the back streets of Central Europe to make secret meetings in little isolated apartments and that sort of thing. But I still don't look like that kind of an adventurous guy. And the reason is much more serious than the joke. Because the reason I don't look like it is because intelligence has changed over these last years since I began my career in it. It's changed remarkably. We, Americans particularly, have conducted 4 major revolutions in intelligence in the last 40-odd years. The first of these we started right after Pearl Harbor, when we looked around to see why we were surprised by that sudden Japanese attack. And we realized that we should have been better warned, because we had information all over the American government that could have warned us better and had us on a better alert. But some of that information was in the Army, some was in the Navy, some was in the State Department, and it hadn't been brought to a central place so that it could be all looked at together and the right conclusions drawn from it. So when President Roosevelt decided he needed an intelligence service to fight the World War II that he was just in, he turned to an old friend of his named William Donovan from New York. He was a lawyer. He's the Donovan in the law firm I'm in today. But he turned to this fellow because he had a reputation of 2 things. First, he was heroic. He'd won a whole slew of medals on the battlefields of France in 1918. But also, he was thoughtful. He was very much of a student, an intellectual. And he was avidly curious about the world. He read all the books, he traveled around, looked at things, and all the rest of it. Now, he had the concept that, yes, he had to send off the people to jump out of airplanes and be spies and guerrilla leaders and so forth. But he also had another concept. He decided to bring here to Washington a group of professors and students and put them here to become the center of American intelligence, become where all the information came. The secret information, the open information. They went to the libraries, they went to the geographic societies, all of that, so that they could centralize all possible information about some of the lost areas of the world that we were suddenly confronted with. Now that started the process of the analysis of information to become intelligence. In other words, mere information isn't intelligence. It has to be analyzed and put through the thought processes of some intelligent and learned people. And so that function started then was the first major revolution, beyond the mere spying and that sort of thing. And that's grown ever since. And there are probably more doctors and masters of every kind of art and science out in CIA than you can find on the faculties of most universities in this country. And that's what they're doing. They're studying. They're receiving all the information that's in the open as well as the secret information, putting it together and drawing conclusions about what it meant. Now, in the 1950s, we discovered that we had a new problem, and it was a very serious problem. Stalin had closed up the Soviet Union. He still had a huge Red Army that threatened Europe. They were developing new weapons, nuclear weapons, and we were having a very difficult time learning what was happening there because there wasn't much open information, and his security systems were sufficiently rough and tough so that it was very hard to get a spy into the Soviet Union. So we looked around for how else we might get that necessary information. And we turned to America's experts in technology, the scientists, the engineers, the manufacturers. We put together one of America's foremost experts in aerodynamics, together with some chemists who were experts on film systems, together with some photo-optics science who understood about cameras. They put together an aircraft that flew further and higher than anyone had to that time. And it flew over the center of the Soviet Union from one side to the other on a number of occasions and brought home pictures of things that we could never get anywhere near. But instead we had good, clear photographs of those things. Now eventually, of course, the Soviets developed a missile that went up far enough to knock that plane down. And there was a big scandal about it for a while. But a couple of years later, we learned that that aircraft had not been engaged in just plain idle curiosity, because another such aircraft flew over the island of Cuba in October 1962, and it brought home some pictures of some funny little shapes on some of the fields outside Havana. And we looked at those. We didn't wonder what those shapes were. We recognized them. Those were the same shapes we'd seen over in the Soviet Union. And we identified them. They were nuclear missiles in the process of being erected to put the United States, except I think for Seattle, under nuclear threat for the first time in history, direct nuclear threat. Well, we also learned by the central analysis that we knew something about those nuclear weapons, because a real live spy had gotten in touch with us, a Soviet officer who was very unhappy about things that were going on there. And he had told us a great deal about their nuclear systems. So that combining this kind of information, our analysts were able to go to our president and tell him exactly what the threat was, and that the particular weapons were not yet in operational status. He had about 10 days to 2 weeks before they would be ready to fire. Well, he used those 10 days to 2 weeks. He negotiated with the Russians about it, but he also prepared the Marines and the other forces to go in and take those out if necessary. And we had the troops on the sea ready to go. The Navy, the Army, the Air Force were all alert. But finally, the Russians blinked. Khrushchev agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba, and the nearest thing we ever came to nuclear war went by, thanks to that advanced analysis of central intelligence, thanks to putting it all together and giving our president the chance to negotiate, as well as to take the other steps necessary to protect our country. Now, that was a revolution in intelligence, using technology to find out what you can't find out by human sources or by open information. And we've continued that in the years since. You are all now sophisticated enough to know about photographic satellites and the electronic ears that we have all around the world, all the different fashions of technology that we used in order to pinpoint precisely what we are facing. We don't ask a spy to slink out of Hong Kong and work his way up at great danger and difficulty through China up to the Soviet border on the north of China, and then to try to communicate with us as to what he sees there, because we look right down on it. We can count the planes, we can count the tanks, we can count the units, We see them move from time to time with a scope of knowledge and a precision of knowledge that no spy could have ever given us. Now that, of course, that technology shows you what's there. It doesn't show you what's going to be there. And that is a separate problem. You do need the real live spy to get into the heads of the leaders of your other countries to see what they're planning to do. Not what they're doing, but what they're planning to do and where they're going. And then that all has to be put together. Does the measurement of the capability seem to support the intention that that man had? We saw an example of it in recent months, when or a year ago today, when Kuwait went into, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait. And the question then, we saw him increase his forces on the Kuwait border from up to 30,000 and then up to 100,000. The question was, is he going to go into Kuwait or not? He told several other presidents and kings that he was not going to. And they passed that word along to our president, that he was not going to. But at the same time, the intelligence agencies, I understand, I haven't seen the report, but I've heard of this, the intelligence agencies came to the conclusion that he was going into Kuwait. And sure enough, he did. Now, here's an example of drawing the conclusion for the future from the various bits of evidence of his character, of his capabilities, of his political line, of his attitudes, all of the rest, bringing it into a conclusion. Now, we are conducting, I think, in this country also, a third major revolution in intelligence, and that is to bring American intelligence under American law and under our Constitution. Now, that's a very novel idea for intelligence, because obviously, if an intelligence officer recruits a spy in some foreign country, he's committing a crime against the laws of that country. And yet nations have always done it. That's what spies are. They are secretly passing information illegally about their country. And you, of course, are in a conspiracy to get them to do so. So the fact that this has happened over the centuries, and the fact that intelligence has been doing it, I think has long given rise to the concept that really there's intelligence and law just can't fit. There's an inconsistency there. They can't get along with each other. And therefore, if you've got to do intelligence, just go ahead and let it happen. Now that was what we started with, was what the British, the French, all the rest of them over the years, the Venetians, way back to Sun Tzu. Essentially, intelligence, go do your own thing. When we set up our intelligence service after World War II, our Congress very loyally, very patriotically said, we don't want to know the secrets of intelligence. That's for the President. Intelligence, spy services, that's not our business in the Congress. And many congressmen have been quoted as saying they just didn't want to know the secrets. Now, that's all right if the intelligence service is a small little spy service at the knee of the president or the king or the prime minister or something. But we began to develop a contradiction here. This new intelligence concept that we had, with the analysts, with the technology, with the action officers, operators, all of it became very, very important and very, very large. Perhaps best exhibited by the fact that in 1960, Allen Dulles, the then director of intelligence, went up the river and built a big building. And he said, I want to have one building so I can put all my experts in it and not have them scattered all over town. And it was a pretty big building, and when they finished the building, they put a sign on the parkway that led to it and said, CIA. Well, there was a neighbor in the area, and he was fairly important at the time. He was the brother of the president and the attorney general. And he drove by this sign one day, and he said, you know, this is the silliest thing I've ever seen. Here's a secret intelligence agency on a 4-lane parkway with a great big sign pointing to it. At least take the sign down. Well, he had a lot of influence, and we took the sign down. And for 15 years, we all pretended that that big building wasn't there, even though every pilot on his way up the Potomac out of National Airport used it as a checkpoint, turn left at CIA. this was the contradiction between the reality and the importance of modern intelligence and the old concept of the little spy service. This other contradiction also then had to be remedied. And that was the contradiction between having something that big and that important run without the congressional attention that we give to every other part of our government. You know that our Constitution calls for the separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial. And it requires that all three be content at a certain course of action before we Americans can really act. Well, here was an exception. This one was just being run by the President and nobody else. And that contradiction had to be resolved. And we resolved it right the way we are now, right in front of the TV cameras with the floodlights and with a lot of hysteria and a lot of sensationalism and everybody screaming at each other. But we did resolve it. We set up a new system. We have committees in the House and in the Senate who are charged to know the secrets and to keep the secrets. And by and large they do, and both. By and large they both know the secrets, they know most of them, and they keep them largely. There's some leakage, I'm sure, but this is a cost of running the kind of a free society through a separation of powers that we have. And so we have that control. And we have a situation where we run the intelligence agencies, not with the whole Congress knowing about them, but a selected group of congressmen and senators who are entitled to know what's happening and who are insistent that Congress play its real role in the supervision of intelligence, as well as the executive. And we've made several changes in the laws to even set up certain special courts so the judiciary can have a proper role in ensuring that the CIA does not violate the rights of American citizens when it collects information. And in this country, if you want to put a wiretap on somebody, you have to go to a judge and get a warrant, because that's a protection of the citizens against the government. But suppose you're abroad. Suppose the CIA thinks you're in touch with a foreign intelligence service abroad. Can they put a bug on you abroad? No. They have to get a warrant from a special court. So the judiciary has its role in the supervision of American intelligence, as well as the legislature. Now, we've had some troubles here recently on that because of the theory that Colonel North had, that since he worked for the NSC and not the CIA, he was not blocked by a congressional resolution that we should not be helping the Contras in Nicaragua. I don't happen to agree with his legal analysis. They've made it clear since that time that kind of a prohibition applies across the government and not just to CIA. But he's paid the price for that in losing his job and losing being subjected to penalties. And I think there are others. The situation is now that the agency must prepare its budget, go up and show it to the congressmen and senators on those committees, justify how many people it's going to have in some faraway country and what they're doing. Does that make sense, Senator? Yes, it does. Okay. No, it doesn't. Stop. And it stops. So it requires the agency to do that. There is also a requirement that the agency, if it's going to do anything other than intelligence gathering, such as any of the paramilitary or political actions they've done over the years, and sometimes have done very well, and sometimes done very badly. Afghanistan was a great success. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster. But both of those were done with the President's direction. Now the President has to sign a piece of paper saying that that kind of action is important to the national security. And that paper has to go to those two Congress committees, so that they know that that action is going on, and so that they can blow a whistle and stop it if they want to. And they have stopped, in a couple of cases, that kind of activity. So this is a revolution in intelligence, bringing the legislature into the supervision. It's not something that we Americans have done alone, however, because other nations have begun to copy us. They're beginning to set up committees in their parliaments and other places to review the work of their intelligence services. And even the KGB in the Soviet Union now is supposed to report to a committee of the Supreme Soviet. I'm not sure the members of that committee are very happy with the job, but at least they're going to go through the motions for a while and be a little gingerly about just how far they go with the reputation that the KGB has. But the idea of having legislative control of your intelligence has even gone so far as the Soviet Union. Now, we have a fourth revolution in intelligence today, and that is the purpose, the function of intelligence. Intelligence used to be the spy steals a secret, gives it to the general, and he wins the battle, and that was about it. But today, as I described the new intelligence system, there's a much more important function to intelligence. It's to help us to know what's happening in the rest of the world, to know it for several reasons, to know it to warn us of dangers, but also to enable us to negotiate about those problems and to reduce those threats to our country. President Gorbachev and President Bush just signed an agreement which will reduce the number of nuclear warheads aimed at the United States and aimed at the Soviet Union by the two superpowers. It won't eliminate them. It's a rather minor reduction at the moment, in my opinion, and should be followed as soon as possible by many more. But the fact is that they did make that agreement. And both of them knew that they would know whether the other fellow complied with the agreement or whether he cheated. And that they will learn from their intelligence services and from some of the procedures that are written into the treaty to help the other side learn what's happening in your own country, to actively promote their knowledge of what you're doing so that you can convince them that you are abiding by the treaty, so that you can be convinced that the other side is abiding by the treaty. Now that's a use of intelligence and its techniques for the purposes of lessening a danger, reducing a threat to our country, not to win a war or defeat the enemy, but to lessen the kind of threat that we all face in this world. And I think this is an important function of modern intelligence. We've seen it a number of times, and in the way that we have been able to move in on a situation rapidly, ahead of time, and convince two other nations not to fight with each other because our intelligence alerted us to the danger that they were going to get into a fight. Various things of this nature are the function of modern intelligence. Now, as you look, however, we are at what you say, the end of the Cold War. It's very clear that the Cold War is over. It's 40 years it's been going on, and it's over. It's over largely because Mr. Gorbachev arranged for it to be over, but it's also over because he and others in the Soviet Union realized that they had to change their policies, that their policies were bankrupting the Soviet Union and ruining them. So with the Cold War, what do we do with intelligence? You know, there's a simple syllogism. Intelligence was important to the Cold War. The Cold War is over, well, therefore disband intelligence. Now, one of our senators has suggested that. Just send it back into the other departments. I disagree with him. I said to him, Senator, problem with your idea is, you know, we did that twice before. After World War I, we figured that peace was at hand, and therefore we wouldn't need intelligence. And we disbanded our intelligence services and reduced them and eliminated them. And one of our secretaries of state closed up a small code-breaking unit in the Department of State because he said, gentlemen, don't read each other's mail. Well, he learned a very few years later that the world is not populated solely by gentlemen or ladies, that there are some tough people out there, and that it's important to read some of their mail so that you're warned of what they're going to do to you. But after World War II, again, the same thing. Peace was here. We disbanded our wartime intelligence service, scattered it around the government, and then realized very shortly afterwards that we needed an intelligence service for the Cold War. And so we had to laboriously put it back together in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And it then did make its contribution to our side of the Cold War. And now that the Cold War is over, do we disband it? And the answer is no. The answer is no for various reasons. In the first place, the Cold War may be over. We're not worried that the Soviet Union is going to launch across the Fulda Gap in Germany and reach the English Channel in 12 to 15 days. No, that's gone. The Soviet forces are going to be 500 miles further east behind their own borders. Most of their tanks that we were fearful of are going to be behind the Urals, another 1,000 miles away. And there's no opportunity, no chance. They've lost control of their allies in Eastern Europe. There's no chance of that kind of an attack. And believe me, after the performance of the American military forces in the Gulf here recently, I think there are lots of general staffs around the world, including the Soviet, who are studying that experience and saying, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to tangle with those Americans. It's too dangerous because of the way in which our people performed in that Gulf War. But are there still enemies? Yes. There are various extremists who call us the Great Satan, people who threaten our citizens, hold them hostage, blow up their airliners, that sort of thing. There are the drug lords that are dangerous. There are countries that are secretly trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, everything from nuclear to biological, as we've seen with Saddam Hussein. There are lots of these dangers around that can be dangerous to our people and our citizens around the world, the terrorists and that sort of thing. So is there a role for intelligence? Yes. Is it a changed role? Yes. We're going to have to be monitoring these remaining nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union. We're not going to have to look at them every 15 minutes maybe, the way we've had to in the past, but at this point we can occasionally check them to make sure they're where they were and the number that they said there were. After all, if another nation has 25,000 nuclear warheads capable of being sent to the United States, we need to be attentive to that problem. And that's the exact number the Soviets have had. This new treaty is going to reduce the intercontinental ones from about 11,000 down to a mere 7,000 or 8,000. But 7,000 or 8,000 nuclear warheads is not something to be joked about. And that's why I say we ought to reduce them even further and very rapidly, is take full advantage of this opportunity to push them down as far as possible. So there will be intelligence. But I think the important thing for an intelligence officer today is to deal with his leadership, his political leadership, government leadership, or for an intelligence officer working for a corporation to deal with his CEO, to try to help his chief lift up his eyes and look ahead. What is going to happen in the next few years? What directions, what are the main events going to be that take way? And let's try that here this morning. What are the main events that you're going to see in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War? Well, I think the biggest event you're going to see is the decline of the military and the strategic and its replacement by economics. The banker, the businessman, the investor, the trader, these will all be the leading players in the next 10 years. The soldiers and the great strategic thinkers will still be there, we'll need some, but they won't be at the center of all our concerns the way they have been. And in the economic area, you're in for a very fast ride. It's going to be a very exciting period. Primarily in Europe, where the 12 nations of the European community will assemble themselves and knock their borders down for free trade and labor movement among those 12 nations. The estimates are that just dropping those border controls is going to increase their gross national product by about 1% per year. Now that doesn't sound like much until you think that Europe has been growing at about 2 to 3% for the last several years. And that's an enormous add-on to that. And the absolute numbers are really amazingly large. So here is more wealth coming out of Europe. A boom, an economic boom, clearly. Sure, they're going to have troubles with the Yugoslavs and people like that once in a while. But they're all going to be fairly minor, no question. And here in the Americas, you're going to see an equal boom. As President Bush has already made the agreement with Canada, and will be making one with Mexico, and is extending his ideas of more free trade zones further to our south in Latin America, with the idea of enterprise for the Americas. Now this will encourage the private growth of industry, business, trading, all the rest of it. What you'll end up with an economic zone and marketplace and production base of 250 million Americans, 26 million Canadians, 80 or 90 million Mexicans, and 200 to 300 million other Latin countries below. A huge trading zone of 600 million people with lots of resources, both in the North and South America, with intelligent workforce. Yes, there are pockets of poverty in Latin America, certainly there are, but there are also a large number of middle-class people there who are good consumers and who are good producers. And we're going to see that whole thing grow and flourish in these next 10 years. And in East Asia. Well, East Asia, of course, has been a star for the last 10 to 20 years. And it's been growing at enormous rates. In East Asia, if you grow at only 6 or 7% a year, that's a recession. Whereas you expect to grow at 10 to 12%. That's the normal for a good East Asian country like Japan or Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, some of the rest of them. Well, you're seeing a big change occur. They have become wealthy over these last years. They've done it by concentrating on exports. Export, export, export. And they've done extremely well by that kind of disciplined work on exports. But there's a change taking place in East Asia. I'll leave China out for the time being. But this change is very significant. In East Asia, most of the military leaders are being replaced by elected leaders, by elected governments. They're not New England town villages yet in terms of the discipline that they have in their societies, following the Confucian model. But nonetheless, they are realizing that they have to spend more time and attention on the welfare of their people. They've got to put more effort and investment into better housing, better roads, more leisure time, and all the rest. The Japanese are seriously moving toward a 5-day week, incredible as that may seem. They may have to lock the factories the 6th day to keep them out, but nonetheless, it's clear what the direction is. And the same is true of Korea, Taiwan, and down into Southeast Asia. Now here, all that productivity, which used to be focused on export, is going to be focused on better lives for their people, opening up large markets for the Americans and others to serve, as well as for their own growth. So these are the three main economic developments in the world in the next 10 years. Clearly, those are the dramatic ones that will make a major difference in the rest of the world. The third world will go slower behind it, but even in the third world, there is hope. When you get a country like India now determining that their belief in state-run socialist economies really didn't do them very well, and they're talking about opening their borders to foreign products and foreign investors. When you get even Brazil and places like that, Brazil, for instance, who said, no foreign computers can ever come in our country. We've got to build our own industry. And then they learned the lesson that any country that closes its borders learns very quickly, that it falls behind. And they fell behind. And now they're talking about opening up their computer business to foreign computers. So these are the big developments. The third world will be a little slow behind. China, I'm afraid, is not going to be a part of this. They are engaged in that age-old process in China where somebody centralizes it, and then it gradually begins to decentralize, and then they began to lose control, and then they re-centralize. Mao centralized it. Deng Xiaoping began to decentralize, began to lose control, insisted on putting it back together. And that's a process that's going to go on in China, and it's going to limit. But it's not going to have much to do with the rest of the world. It's not going to influence very many other countries or economies or anything else. So that's the biggest development of the decade. Keep your eye on those three main things. The second development will be a reflection of the end of the Cold War, and you can see it in simple numbers. that for the last 3 or 4 years of the Cold War, all of us humans together have spent about $1 trillion each year on military forces and weapons. $1 trillion each year. About 30% of that by the United States, about 30% of that by the Soviet Union, and about 20% of that by our NATO and Warsaw Pact allies. In other words, $800 billion a year was mostly devoted to the Cold War. And we said the Cold War is over. Is there going to be a reduction of the military? Yes. Our government has already called for a reduction of our forces from 2.1 million to 1.6 million men and women to bring them down. I have some arguments about how they want to spend some of their money on some of the weapon systems, but which I disagree with. But nonetheless, the fact is that in this country and in lots of other countries, the military is going down rapidly. Soviet armed forces are down by 500,000, and they're going further down. The German army used to consist of 2 armies, one in West Germany of 450,000 men, one in East Germany of about 400,000 men. The combined German army will be closer to 350,000, opening up that many Germans to go to work to do something more productive than march around and shoot at each other. And this is going to be the trend all around the world. My estimate is that the peace dividend could be at least half of the present expense on defense. We could reduce it to that. And that would mean that our country, could reduce further than our government has in mind today, and further than many people would agree with me. But nonetheless, when you consider that we sent to the Gulf War, our most recent heavy demand for our military, we sent about 17% of our military forces. Now, if we did that good a job with 17% of our total forces, we could certainly handle some other Saddam Hussein who blew up somewhere in the world with a 30% of half the force. And that would still leave us 2/3 of the force here as a reserve and for the other support functions. So the reduction of our forces could be in that order. Now, will it? We'll have a lot of arguments about it and so forth. But certainly there is going to be a huge demand for capital. And that's where it's going to come from. The capital for rebuilding our roads and bridges, the capital for improving our educational system, the capital for solving the problems of some of our bombed out cities, all that sort of thing. We need to adopt a new concept of the word national security, which we have always thought refers to soldiers and sailors. No, we need to get a concept which says, look, if our country were being invaded by a 1 million-man army, we'd all be alert. We'd be ready to meet it and defend it. Got news for you. We are invaded every year by 1 million men and women. They come over our borders. We've lost control of our frontiers. And these people come in. Now, these are good people. My image is that if there are 2 brothers in some southern Mexican village, and one's lazy and one's energetic, you know which one comes here, the energetic one. And that's the way this country has been made over the last 2 centuries of its existence. So the fact is that these are good people, but how do you avoid that invasion? We learned here that it's not by soldiers, it's not by policemen, it's not by border controls and barbed wire. The way we solved the migration of the rural poor of our South into our northern cities, which comprised about 3 decades from 1920 to 1950, was finally, and we stuffed them in the ghettos, and we've treated them so badly that we're still suffering the results of that terrible situation. But we also discovered that when we developed the Sun Belt in the Southwest and the Southeast and the South, that the reverse migration began to take place. In other words, the chore is to develop a Sun Belt further to our south so that those people can have hopes and careers and jobs down there rather than coming here to do the dirty jobs that some of the Americans don't want to do. Now, if you saw a city with the population huddled in their broken down houses and large areas of the place bombed out, Would you say that's a part of our national security? Well, I've just described places like the South Bronx, parts of Washington, Detroit, Chicago, other areas. These are threats to the security and safety of our people. We are faced with a new plague coming out of Africa. It's called AIDS. It's like the Black Death that swept over Europe in the 13th century. It can wreak terrible havoc on our people. Is that a question of our security? It is. Was that something we'll meet by weapons and guns? No. We'll meet it by programs of medical care, research, and all the rest of it. All of these are definitions of national security. And I think they need to be put in the same kind of category so that we can get a trade-off between whether we really need another new submarine or whether we need to put that kind of money into a program against the spread of AIDS. I think that trade-off is more direct. We talk about now, Senator Nunn has advocated the development of a anti-ballistic missile system. And he says it's just a little one. It's only going to cost $30 or $40 billion or something nobody really knows. But is that a real threat? It was supposed to be in case somebody launches a nuclear weapon at us from someplace in the future. That would be a devastating thing to do, of course. But of course it only covers things that come through space. It wouldn't cover an aircraft or a boat or anything like that, which could go here. So we're going to spend $30 billion to try to build that kind of thing, if the Senate has its way. I hope it doesn't. Is that a useful way? Or should we be concerned about the thousands of our fellow citizens who are being killed today as a result of the drug wars and the riots and the terrible situations in some of our center cities? Here we're losing thousands of our fellow citizens every day. Are we handling that as a question of our security? I think we should. So this, I think there is this peace dividend. We could use it for something, and I think we need to be very attentive about it. And my last nominee for the important development of the next 10 years is the Soviet Union. And here I remember three dates: 1918, 1945, 1989. Each of those dates marked the end of a war. And after 1918, the victorious Allies in World War I crushed their former enemies. They changed their governments, they changed their boundaries, they exacted reparations. And what did we all get out of that? Adolf Hitler. After World War II, we decided to be more sensible. We decided to try to lift our former enemies, to become responsible members of the international community. And we've done, let's say, such a good job that it's somewhat ironic that our two former enemies of World War II are today the richest two countries in the world. But we're all a lot better off. Now our former enemy of the Cold War lies in ruins. His politics is a disaster. His economy is hopeless. His very society is fragmented and broken. What are we going to do about it? Do we just let it fester and let all sorts of noxious things come out of it? Or is there a way that we can help them to rise up and become a responsible member of the international community? A better life for the peoples of that country. I think the decision whether we should do that has in a sense already been made by Mr. Bush. The question now is how? And that's not an easy job. The Marshall Plan after World War II was comparatively simple. There all you had to do was put the factories back together that had been bombed out. But once they got back together, the institutions were all there within which they could be productive. Here the problem is, in the Soviet Union, the problem is the institutions. That's the real thing. They have to be pushed out of the way and replaced by new institutions. Will that happen? Can it happen? I think it's a call upon all of us to do all we can to make sure that can happen. It won't happen quickly. It's not a 5-year job. It's not a 10-year job. It's more like a 25-year job, I think. But every step you take will make things better. The question for a Russian citizen is not whether he's going to be living on the same scale as an American. The question for him is whether he lives better this year than he did last year. And if that kind of a positive curve develops, then I think the problems of the Soviet Union are over, and they can work their way up gradually into a decent situation. Now, these are the big challenges of the 90s. The rest of the areas, I say, are sort of marginal. But the one overriding factor of the next years is what we saw in the Gulf War. Every previous Middle Eastern crisis has been immediately followed by a squabble in the local area and an immediate confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans with the threat of nuclear war. That's what happened in 1914, when a little local squabble in the Balkans took place, and the great powers lined up on opposite sides, and they ended up in a war that lasted 4 years and killed millions of people, and now the historians barely understand what that war was all about. Now, in the Middle East, that same threat existed, a local fight, and then the Soviets and Americans confronting each other. But in the Gulf War, that did not happen. The end of the Cold War has meant that every little local fight around the world does not have to become the subject of a Soviet-American confrontation. That some people will insist on killing each other in various parts of the world, but that will not engage the Soviets and the Americans with brandishing nuclear weapons at each other. Now that puts a whole new dimension on the kind of world we can live in, and a much more positive one. I think that it will call for the United Nations to play a bigger role in solving these little local squabbles to the extent they can, but we all do not have to live in the fear that we have lived for the last 40-odd years that we faced World War III, because it's not going to happen. And therefore, I think when you get to the end of this decade and you look back on what happened in the years of the 1990s, I think you're going to say, gee, maybe those were the gay 90s. Thank you very much. Be glad to answer questions on anything you want. Yes, sir.
My name is Craig McKinley from Ramapo College of New Jersey. You had originally stated that because after the Cold War you did not believe that the Central Intelligence should be disbanded. And then you went on to say that the military is being reduced. And then you went on to speak about different domestic policies that need some kind of way of confronting now. Do you feel that at least the intelligence committees should be reduced? I mean, we have the Central Intelligence, we have FBI, CIA, many state agencies. Do you feel that possibly we could reduce those now as we're reducing our armies?
We can certainly reduce the Defense Intelligence and the CIA. And in other words, we don't need probably as many satellites as we have had in the past 10 years. We can get along with a few once in a while rather than daily coverage. When the threat goes down to a 45, 60-day threat from a 2-week threat, when a threat goes on to a next year threat maybe, or 5 years from now threat, you obviously can be much more relaxed about the way you do it. You will have to change some people from studying Russian to studying Arabic, things of that nature, because I think we will expect to do a better job on such problems as terrorism and hostages. But because our priority has been the Soviet Union, and properly so, since they were the major threat to our country. But now we'll be able to shift some of it into other areas, but there will be a net reduction, yes. Did you have one?
Yes, Tom Higdon from Eckerd College. I was just curious. The CIA has a very bad reputation as far as public opinion is concerned. And you definitely don't give off the type of CIA director that I was expecting. But I was wondering if you could just tell me something about the activities such as overthrowing governments and the supposed assassinations that the CIA has undertaken, or if you're allowed to talk about things like that.
Sure, I can answer that. I've answered them all in front of the Congress, so I can answer them again. You're right, it has a reputation. Everybody, I'm thinking of an article I saw in the Financial Times. Front page, top center, Financial Times headline about a week or two ago. CIA blocked BCCI investigation. I looked down to the story to see what the story actually said. And in the story it said, the people conducting the investigation say that they were not, that they didn't have the cooperation they should from the Department of Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the State Department, the CIA, and the Bank of England. But which one goes in the headline? That's part of the problem. I mean, it is good copy, and it gets up there. With respect to the activities CIA has done over the years, this was investigated very carefully by the Congress in the mid-70s, and we went through everything we had done for the last 25 years at that time. And there were cases in which we had worked against governments, yes. There were some awfully dumb efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro. There were some secret wars that CIA conducted, things of that nature. But the investigation determined that the CIA was not out of control. It was not a rogue elephant. If anything, it was too much under the control of our presidents. That everything it did had been directed by presidents, no question about it. And the comment that the Senate committee made, which was not a bad report, was that in fact the blame is that Congress didn't do its job of supervising. And since that time they have, of course. And since that time you have this very set procedure by which CIA will report. Now there was a very interesting example of that. It took place about a year ago. We were having a great deal of trouble with Mr. Noriega in Panama. And we were committed to turn the canal over at the end of the century to the elected representatives of the Panamanian people. And he wasn't the elected representative by a long shot. He went out and beat up the vice president in the campaign and stole the election, as everybody said. So the question was, can we get rid of Mr. Noriega? And one idea was, well, can't CIA get some of the colonels in the Panama Defense Force to stage a coup against him, get rid of him? And they went up to the Congress with that idea, and they discussed it. And somebody raised the question, suppose he's killed in the process of a coup. Won't we be blamed with his assassination? And they hummed and hawed, and finally they withdrew the idea. They did not go ahead with it. Now instead we sent 25,000 American soldiers. We killed about 200 or 300 or 300 or so Panamanian citizens. We lost about 40 of our own. Now was that the right answer? I think it was, because what we did in Panama fits into such a long history of things we've done there, and since certainly Noriega was nobody's favorite fellow. But if we had been involved in or charged with an assassination of him, or if he were killed in the process of a coup, you'd still be hearing about it. Just as we heard for 15 years about the death of President Allende of Chile, which was blamed on CIA in many, many areas. And now it's only come out to be clear that CIA had nothing to do with it. If anything, he probably killed himself. That's the best estimate as to what happened to Mr. Allende. But with the secrecy and the rich imaginations, then you do get this kind of run of opinion. Now, I'm not saying that all the operations we did were good either. One conclusion the committee came to was that CIA had never assassinated any foreign leader. None. Now, it wasn't for lack of trying on Castro, but nonetheless, and I'm against it. I'm the guy who wrote the first directive saying we will not do anything in the world of assassination. But I also say let's get some balance into what our image of CIA really is. And yes, it will do projects if our president and our Congress agree with them. It has been engaged for the last 10 years in a project in Afghanistan to help the Afghan people throw the Russians out of Afghanistan. The Russians are gone from Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is no Garden of Eden, but nonetheless, that was a useful project and it went well. We also have been helping a group in Angola. It's an interesting story because we began helping them because the Cubans began to appear in Angola. We began helping the other side, in about 1974. At the end of 1975, the Congress decreed no more help to Angola. And I turned the key that turned it off. No more. And then about 1982 or 3, the Congress said, okay, we repeal that prohibition. And since that time, I gather, we have been helping that side. And now the two sides in Angola have come to an agreement on a ceasefire and put together some kind of a joint government, which was the object of our support all along. But I think were we supporting in Angola? Yes. Were we doing it as directed by our president and with the knowledge and approval of the Congress? Yes. So some of these things, there have been several investigations that have said, you know, maybe we ought to stick to just intelligence gathering and not do anything more than that. Maybe we should avoid any of these kinds of covert actions because they create so much trouble. And in each case, the congressional committees that made those studies came to the conclusion. One was the Church Committee in 1975. One was the recent Iran-Contra study. In each case, they said, let's be careful about them, but let's not do away with the weapon. We may need it in various situations. And I think that's a sensible conclusion about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dave Deal from Indiana University. I was just wondering if you think that the CIA's position on the war on drugs and what they're doing has been successful, or exactly what's going on and how their advances are coming in.
I'm not all that informed, but I gather what the CIA has done is put together an intelligence center for the drug war. You see, CIA is not a law enforcement agency. It's not allowed to engage in law enforcement. So you have to be very careful in how you go into certain situations if you hope to put somebody on trial. Because if you violate his rights in the process of getting the information that you use against him, you can't try him. And that's a very delicate procedure that you have to follow so that you can gather the information which is available, but not go so far as to interfere with the rights and frustrate a trial against the individual. I think that's about what CIA can do. I don't think it should go into the chasing them down individually or that sort of thing. I do think that if CIA gets information, it obviously gives it to the Drug Enforcement Administration and others, and to the Department of Justice for prosecution, if it comes across information in its regular business. But I don't think that the CIA is carrying the main burden of the drug war. That's the DEA's job. And my own view of the drug war is that it ain't much of a war. When the president said he was going to spend $7 billion on the drug war, I don't think the United States can conduct a war for $7 billion. That's not a war, it's a program. And clearly, we can fool around with the drug lords in Colombia or the peasants in Peru to the extent we can, but we're not going to solve this until we get to the demand side, to the demand market. And that's to be done by social work. The most encouraging statistic I've seen recently is two lines on a graph. One showed that the addictive use of narcotics has gone up. In other words, there are more addicts. But it also said the casual use has gone down. Now that's the important one, because it's no longer chic to use drugs in the fancy nightclubs and so forth, the way it was for a while. And if that goes down, then it's sort of like cigarettes and even alcohol. It's a small percent of your population kills themselves with it, but the greater bulk of your population begins to turn it away. And that's the way to affect the drug war, it seems to me. Get the lesson out that it's bad for you and that it's not a good thing to do, and gradually you'll eliminate it. But that requires an awful lot of educational work and social work, and I don't see it being done. And that could use some more of those billions for a war. Yes, sir.
Ryan Kambrov, San Diego State University. There's been some criticism in the press and whatnot about the performance of U.S. intelligence in the Persian Gulf War. as far as overestimating its capabilities and things like that. I was wondering, how do you, what's your stance on that?
Well, two or three things. I told you the story about the estimating, was he going to go into Kuwait? And there the intelligence people did apparently call it right. Secondly, the president is the major customer for intelligence, and he has said he has been very, very satisfied with the performance of the intelligence people. Now, he's the best judge because he sees it all. And if he thinks it's good, then the rest of us have to accept that it must be good. I think that yes, we probably overestimated the total fighting qualities of the Iraqi. But let's face it, I don't think anybody thought them of being subjected to the kind of pounding that they got when they estimated that fighting quality. They did pretty well against the Kurds and the Shiites. It's just when they ran up against the U.S. Air Force and the Navy that they had a little troubles. And so, I would say another thing, that an intelligence officer should try not to find the most comforting kind of an answer to a question. Because if you tell a general that it's going to be a breeze, there's no trouble, then the general's not apt to be trying very hard, and he may lose it. No general worth his salt ever plans just barely to win a battle. He plans to win it hands down, and then he best barely wins it frequently. Eisenhower held up the invasion of Europe for a whole year in order to build up enough forces to be sure that when he went over into France, he would actually be able to stay there. And he just barely made it. Now, and you think of what the history of the world would be like if he had been thrown off. It's shattering. So the other thing, General Schwarzkopf said that he didn't get all the information he wanted. He says some of the information always was sort of, well, it may be this or it may be this, or there were disagreements among the intelligence officers. First place, no tactical commander has ever or will ever be satisfied with his intelligence. He's going to insist that he needs more than is ever there. And that's a natural attitude. Yes, there are undoubtedly differences in the intelligence community as to how strong the forces are or where they are, various things. And in that case, they try to tell the general that there is a difference of opinion among the experts as to where it is. And so that the general knows that there's a difference. Now the general wants an answer, but nobody knows the answer. And so they tell him, we don't know the answer, but here's the difference. Appreciation, it's one or the other. I mean, in illustration, it's frustrating to a tactical commander to be faced with that. But suppose you're the commander and somebody tells you that the enemy tank weighs 100 tons, and therefore it can't go across a certain bridge. And then somebody else says, no, our estimates are that the tank only weighs 90 tons. And that bridge is strong enough to take a 90-ton tank. Well, you're the tactical commander. Which do you take? I think you take the 90-ton, just to protect yourself against the possibility that he'll come there. But you're unhappy when you find out, when they send a tank out on the bridge and the bridge goes crash, and you've had a lot of force up there ready to meet them, and suddenly they have nothing to do and you could be using the forces over here. You're annoyed at the intelligence. And you understand that. No women? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Mindy Love. I'm from Drury College in Springfield, Missouri. And there seems to be a contradiction between what you say we need to do with this money we're going to get in a cut in defense budget and what is actually going to be done. They've already made new plans for this. How can we be sure this is going to be going back into the social problems that can no longer be ignored? Talk
to your congressman. That's the only way. That is the way.
Is there a general feeling in Washington, though, is everyone wanting to go back, put it back into the military? Or?
Well, the politics of Washington are the following. The Democrats voted for more sanctions and not the war. I think we were wrong, and I took that position too. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm both, or neither. But I think I was wrong in saying we should have stayed with more sanctions, because if Saddam did not yield to the kind of air pounding he got, he wasn't about to yield to an economic sanctions. And I think that therefore the president was correct in launching the attack when he did. And of course they did such a spectacular job. Well, who comes out as the hero? The president, the Republicans, and the military. The Democrats are now in a position of having voted the wrong way on the Gulf War. And they're trying to find a way so that they can get back into a positive line. And therefore they're not going to vote against new weapons. They're not going to be down as the peaceniks. And that's what's going to carry some of the additional investment along, I'm afraid, unless they begin to hear it. And they will hear it from the states and the cities and the people and the editorials and all the rest. If they begin to get the kind of heat on that subject, then I think you'll get more attention. You may give the military more than they really need, but you know, we've been doing that for a long time. There's nothing new about that. But the question is, can you slice some of it off for some of these other security issues that we have? And I think that just requires a demand by the population. Now the government says, of course, it's broke. Well, I claim you can't walk into a shopping mall in this country and say this country's broke. We don't like to pay taxes, that's right. But the country ain't broke by a long shot. And if we had the will to solve some of these problems, we could solve them tomorrow morning. No problems. But that means developing that will in exactly the places you come from, all around the country, and pushing the congressmen and the senators to take a more positive view toward some of these issues. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Russell. I work at the Washington Center. Do you think that the military and the CIA should intervene further in Iraq to try and overthrow Saddam Hussein or try to diminish his power since he's caused so much upheaval in the Middle East?
Well, I think what we have expected and not seen happen is what I call the traditional form of change of government in Iraq. That if a leader has done such a slovenly job as Saddam Hussein has and caused all that problems for his country, you'd think they would change the government. And the way you change the government in Iraq is two colonels walk up behind him and shoot him. That's how he got in power, and that's how his predecessor got in power. So I think that's been the assumption that that's going to happen. We don't want to have anything to do with that action. We don't want to participate in it. We will keep the sanctions on. We will keep pushing at the UN for further inquiries into this nuclear thing, which was further along than we would have liked to see it, things of that nature. And yes, if we run into a real roadblock, we could take at least some demonstration strike, probably by air, against some of his installations. We'll have a little trouble with some of the United Nations members on that, who went along with us on the first because it was so flagrant. But we'll have troubles with some of the countries of whether we should go do that again or not. And we'll want to do it with the other countries. We won't want to do it alone. So that's a delicate negotiating problem. Saddam is not a threat to his neighborhood now, and therefore the other countries don't want to see too much going on. You know, the Arab countries want the Americans out. Saudi Arabia wants them out of Saudi Arabia because large numbers of Americans bring a large number of Americanisms into the country, and that upsets the way they've been running it. Even the women might demand to be driving cars or something. Yes, sir.
Yes, Tom Higdon from Eckerd College again. A follow-up on what we were talking about earlier about Manuel Noriega. I was just curious, what connection did he have with the CIA before he got into power, and were we responsible to some degree for his installation?
No, I don't think we were responsible for his installation in any way. He was, there was a previous leader there named Torrijos, who ran the country, but ran it relatively well, I think. Noriega was his intelligence officer, and correspondingly we had some relations with him as the intelligence officer for Panama. And in that sense we had connections with him. I don't know whether they paid him something or not. I really just don't know the details of that. But we dealt with him as the appointed intelligence officer of his government, which we've done around the world in lots of places with people we haven't liked very much. But there he is. You have to deal with him. And so that, I think, would be the extent of it, what it would amount to. But I'm sure we didn't help him get into power. I don't think. He arranged that on his own. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Gail Maddox, U.S. Naval Academy. I just want to switch regions for a minute and ask you in particular about Eastern Europe, and maybe more specifically about East Germany, but generally about Eastern Europe. It seems to me that the calculations, the analysts, at least what you saw in the open literature, was way off about the revolutions of 1989.
Yeah.
And when you look at East Germany, it seems that we really swallowed a lot of what now seems to have been very bogus data and indicators and everything of what their economic situation was. How would you assess that? Is this a great intelligence failure? Was it impossible to have foreseen?
Let's separate two things. The estimate of the German economy, East German economy and the sort of lifestyle, I think we were well aware of the horrible pollution problems. I think we were aware of the heavy nature of the industrial thing. We thought of East Germany as perhaps more productive than Poland and Czechoslovakia and so forth, and they probably were. I think certainly nobody in the world anticipated the collapse of the whole zone in the way it happened. That would be beyond anybody's wildest dream. And I gather the thing that did it was the fact that the young people began to leave the country. And they first began to leave through the other countries, through Hungary and through Czechoslovakia, to get out of East Germany. And then somebody literally made a mistake at one point and said, yes, they can go through the wall. And a roar, they went through. But apparently that order was not a consciously arrived at order. It was kind of a garble that got in, and suddenly the guys at the gates opened them up, and woof, they went through them. And then the thing was just totally out of hand. And of course the other Eastern European countries copied the example. You get a sense, of what's there, and I assure you nobody could have predicted this. When Secretary Baker went to Tirana, the capital of Albania, Albania has been totally isolated from everybody in the world for the last 45 years. Nobody's been in or out. And yet when he got there, 250,000 people came out to the main square with little handmade American flags. I mean, I don't think anybody in the world could have anticipated that kind of attitude. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Lisa Tornquist from the University of the Pacific in California. I have two questions. The first one is, why wasn't Seattle put under a nuclear attack warning? And the second goes way back to the Vietnam War, because I learned that before the war we wanted to enter, but there was no way to get in, so we bombed a ship or blew one up, so that was our way to enter. I was wondering if you thought that was true.
The reason Seattle was not under a threat from Cuba was the range of the missiles at that time. It was the only part of the United States as far away from Cuba as possible, but the range just was short of Seattle. Otherwise the range of those missiles covered the rest of the United States. The other question is, what you're referring to is the Tonkin Gulf incident. And there, what happened was we had advisors. We didn't have combat troops in Vietnam at that time. We had a lot of advisors. We were flying helicopters for them and all that sort of thing, support work, but we weren't directly in it. And our Navy was offshore. And our Navy was offshore in the international waters off North Vietnam. We had various listening devices and things like that to listen to what they had. One night, clearly a couple of torpedo boats came out and made a pass at one of our ships. Now, that happened clearly that night. The next night, the ships themselves, I think, got totally confused and thought there was another attack. But it develops that it really didn't take place. They just got confused. Now, the negative, that, in other words, and the President ordered a bombing in southern part of North Vietnam in retaliation for the attack on our ships. The unsaid part of it, and a part of the things that made the scandal, was that for the past several months, our military had been supporting the Vietnamese military on some landings in North Vietnam of some agents going up the coast by ship and sometimes shooting up a military post or doing something up there to try to bring some of the pain that the South Vietnam was receiving back to the origin in North Vietnam. But these were highly secret attacks and highly secret motions. But the reason I think the North Vietnamese sent the two torpedo boats is they thought that our ships coming up out in international waters were the same thing, that they were coming up to do the same operations that we had done the night or two before. And when the President reported the attack on the ships, he didn't mention anything about these other boats being there. And then the Congress discovered it and said, oh, now this is, you know, you're just pulling the wool over our eyes. You're not telling us the whole story. And that's where the dispute arose about keeping those secret missions secret when they really did relate to the attack on our ship. And there was a real attack on the ship, no question about it. But you then see another dimension of how serious it is once you learn about the other boats going up in that area. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.